Thanks for clicking on this video. Be sure to subscribe and click the bell icon and turn on all notifications to keep up to date with the latest information and discussions. It's all kicking off now, isn't it? Now, I'm not just talking about the Saiyans, but other things in the world as well. Hey guys, MasakoX here. Now, the Saiyans and their history has been the subject of great change within the world of Dragon Ball in the last few years. Since 2014, we have undergone quite a comprehensive change with what we thought was true in regards to, the whole origins of the Saiyans, as well as Son Goku himself. We have had a decent amount of lore given to us in the form of original Daizenshuu books from the 90s, but there was some big omissions from that time period that we feel like, they needed to be explained, or at least touched upon in some way. Now, with, you guessed it, the Dragon Ball Super Broly movie, we might be able to start to add some more meat to this part of the Saiyan legacy, because we all know that Saiyans love a bit of meat. Now, in the last video, we talked about the ancient history of the Saiyans in the first part of this general discussion. In it, we talked about Yamoshi, the original subject of the movie that came out last year, before Toriyama took a chance on Broly, with great success, it must be said. With Yamoshi's original musings in the Battle of Gods movie, we deduced that the lineage of Goku, Vegeta and Broly can be traced back to the original Super Saiyan legend, and therefore bring forth the destiny angle and adding even more substance to it, instead of it just being a tenuous hook for the sake of the movie that kind of petered out within 40 minutes. Destiny was in the form of Yamoshi's line, versus the evil Saiyans in the form of Broly, who subsequently moved away from evil and instead wanted to lead a life of contentment after years of loneliness and purity. When we were talking about Saiyan history in terms of numbers and whatnot, we left our favorite monkey people in age 550, when they had reached planet Plant. How did they end up off the original planet Sadala of their own volition? Where the Universe 6 Saiyans still reside to this day, I must say. Well, as we mentioned at the end of the last episode, there are two versions of this event depending on who you ask or whose historic interpretation you subscribe to. One of them says that they were moved by a mysterious spaceship after a great sea change on planet Sadala, and the other supposition muses the idea that they simply stole a vessel from a passing colony in need of a pit stop. They just jumped them. The last pit stop that those people would ever have. We don't really know for certain who was the owner of such a means of transportation around that time period to transport hundreds or even thousands of rabid Saiyans, but we have two likely candidates that could be quite interesting to discuss: the Sulfurians or King Cold's Cold Force. For the purposes of our discussion, plus from our earlier videos on the subject of King Cold, we are going to assume that King Cold, or at the very least his ancestor, was already a big deal in that time period. That and the Cold Force had long reigned over the galaxy, and that the king was established for a good amount of time, or was in his heyday, around that time period. You might think that this might be a bit far-fetched to suggest that King Cold is centuries of years old, but I think this assumption is not that big of a stretch. We talk about this in a previous video on the possible traits of Frieza's species, link in the description and up top if you're indeed curious. Okay, so why would a King Cold vessel be on planet Sadala in age 550 then? There are two ideas that might be viable. First off, if the Saiyans stole one of the Cold Force's ships, it might be that what sparked the interest from the Galactic Emperor in the first place in regards to the Saiyans. The king might have been impressed that these somewhat primitive creatures could overwhelm his superior forces and then pilot a craft with little or no exposure to its technology. Are they something therefore he could use? Possibly. Secondly, if Cold moved them from Sadala to planet Plant of his own volition, perhaps this was all part of a much grander plan. Perhaps the Sulfurians of planet Plant were proving to be annoying flies who wouldn't back down in terms of being conquered by King Cold. Now, instead of getting his own hands dirty, why would he do such a thing? What better thing to do than to grab these strong-looking monkeys and get them to do his bidding? They get a new planet, maybe? And he gets a new battalion for his force. Win-win as far as he's concerned. That is, of course, just one idea. It's also possible that the Sulfurians might have discovered the Saiyans on their own and found them exceedingly interesting as a species. Little did they know, though, that whilst exploring space and then taking these Saiyans on as pets, they brought doom to themselves and their entire people in the long run. by finding the ruined planet Sadala, being taken down by the Saiyans, and then leading them right to their own homeworld. How? Well, their ships would have still contained the coordinates to their own home planet, Planet Plant. The Saiyans could have jumped the Sufurian crew, taken the vessel, and then crash-landed on Planet Plant, and then just did what they wanted to do. Now that we know that the Saiyan-Sufurian scuffle didn't begin in earnest until about 170 years or so later, we had about 2 centuries of relative peace between the two species. Perhaps this time was something where the Sufurians viewed this species as a curiosity or primitive, therefore they're not a threat. Maybe worth their time in terms of research, but other than that, it's a bit up in the air about what they can do. Now perhaps the Saiyans were biding their time and chose to wait for the right opportunity to pounce. They were few in number, and so the chance of mixing were minimal. For now, the mud huts were sufficient on this big planet. As we get closer to the tussle, there are 2 versions of this story that we could follow. One comes from Dragon Ball GT's lore. Now hear me out, GT could be useful here. On one hand, Baby claims that the Saiyans attacked the peaceful Sufurians without any prior provocation. The technology-driven civilization was just acting in self-defense. On the other hand though, Vegeta claims that the Sufurians have treated the Saiyans pretty poorly ever since the Saiyans arrived on Planet Plant. The warrior race were treated like slaves and were forced to live in a harsh environment instead of choosing to do so of their own volition or even living amongst the Sufurians. Which one is the accurate tale? Well, it seems most likely that it might have been a mixture of the two. But before that massive argy-bargy started, long before it was even mooted to occur, there was one more important event that happened. One that would change the Dragon Ball universe forever and set about the last Saiyan bastion. That's right, between the ages of 703 and 712, Nappa was born. Hey Vegeta, look, I've just got born. I'm new. Okay, jokes aside. Nappa's birth came around 20 to 30 years prior to another turning point in Saiyan history, and that was their victory over technology and the Sufurians. Now apparently, according to King Kai, the Saiyans were then discovered by King Cold in age 731, so merely a year after they had claimed the planet. Maybe even just a few months after the fact they claimed the planet. Wait, so King Cold discovered them? Or maybe rediscovered them? Or maybe he decided to make himself known again. It's almost like King Cold had waited for the Saiyans to seize the planet for themselves and then came back into their lives when the job was done. His memory lost to legend or just blind ignorance, so maybe they wouldn't know who he was and he could just claim to be someone else. Maybe he even aided them in their uprising somehow. The age 731 was already the time of the reign of Vegeta III, King Vegeta to you and I, which would date the start of the Vegeta dynasty in the realm of age 640 or 660, well into the Saiyan settlement on Planet Plant, which seems to be a curious development. Especially if we take into consideration that in the Broly movie, this time around, the meeting between the Force and the Saiyans takes place in age 732. But we already see Cold's influence over the Royal Saiyan architecture and technology. Perhaps as in, the Saiyans are either aping what their concept of a king was from what they saw of King Cold, as well as all the other trappings from their benefactor, supposedly. The way how the Scouters are introduced in the movie may indicate that their predecessors, the Scout Scopes, might have also come from the Cold Force, that original tech given to them in the Saiyan Saga flashback, you know, the Arcosians, again, dubbism name. We could of course debate this for ages. If some of the technology had indeed been salvaged from the Sufurian remnants, someone would have had to educate the Saiyans on how to use it against other people, or maybe for someone else entirely. So maybe having the Cold Force secretly preparing the Saiyans seems like a thing that could actually happen. Also, according to the timeline, Frieza took over after King Cold in age 732, so again, not so long after the initial rediscovery or discovery to the Saiyans. In the Broly movie, you can almost feel that these relations seem to be way more complicated and lasted for far longer than a mere year. That's why we think that Cold's influence over the Saiyans, or at least the royal family, lasted for far longer than the Saiyan society as a whole knew. All this could be a just cause for maybe a timeline retcon, because if you think about it, it would be rather weird, not impossible though, for tribal Saiyans to develop a monarchy with Sufurians still being around. We've talked about this before, about how fast we think Saiyans could possibly evolve given the right circumstances, going from huts to palaces in just 20 years. Is that just a thing that Saiyans do? Hard to say without more evidence though. As for King Vegeta's grandfather, he would have had to have dated from at least 50 years in the past, as we don't really know the age of King Vegeta, Vegeta III, who could be between his late 30s and mid-50s. You know, saying aging and all that makes it confusing. We just don't know. It's worth noting though, that in age 732, it marks the births of Vegeta IV and Broly. Later, somewhere between ages 733 and 737, Tuffle is born and swiftly forgotten about. 737 marks also the birth of Kakarot, or at least it used to. But seeing how big he is in the Broly movie, it's hard to tell if this is still considered canon. Or maybe it still is his birth, as in his removal from the nursing pod and his arrival in the physical world, having to fend for himself on Earth. It might still make it viable, that birth date. Curiously enough, we don't have any data about Raditz's birth, but if we were to guess, he'd have been born no later than age 732. Most likely earlier than that. Age 737 also marks the beginning of the original Bardock special, which in part could still happen when you watch the Broly movie quite closely. You notice there were some cuts, and thusly, the destruction of planet Vegeta. The end of the Saiyan race as we knew it. Now what's interesting is the official number of the survivors that we have. Before the Broly movie, we assumed that there were only 5 survivors: Goku, Vegeta, Raditz, Nappa, and now Tuffle. Now we know that there are at least 4 more: Paragus, Broly, and 2 unnamed Saiyans that accompanied Raditz and Vegeta. Yes, of course, we could add Turles to the equation, but he is yet to be added to the super lore, so for now, we're going to omit him from the notion, just letting you know. There of course could be more out there that chose to ignore Frieza's orders and then flee once hearing the news of Vegeta's blowing up. This, however, feels like Toriyama and Toei leaving a purposeful possibility of there being more Saiyans out there, if they ever have the need of introducing a few more. It's deliberately left open-ended for the chances of more Saiyans to come in and make even more money. The Broly movie has sorted out a lot of what we know about the Saiyans, whilst at the same time vastly complicating the timeline. Dragon Ball, time, it's a very tricky relationship, isn't it? But it also has shown us how the society worked and made it more believable than ever before. One of the things that I think has been often misinterpreted is the fact that not all Saiyans have to be combatants, contradictory to their previous status as a warrior race, and a warrior race alone. What we saw in this movie was that the Saiyans were like any other kind, who just so happened to specialize in combat. But there were other jobs to fill, and they filled them well. Whilst not all Saiyans, like Beats, were combatants, I'm pretty sure that all of them had to go through some kind of basic fighting training, like using weapons, armor, or a scouter. After all, we don't really see them in civilian gear, and while, as we know from Paragus, things like the Great Ape transformation wasn't for everyone, I'm pretty sure that the average human would be easily overpowered, even by the likes of Beats, if they actually had a full-scale takedown of a planet that required every single Saiyan to do so. The movie has also finally shown us some actually brilliant Saiyan scientists. Now, if you look at them, you can notice that all of them are lacking tails. They might have cut their tails off to assume better control or focus on their job. There might be something more to it. You see, the lady, whose name is Neon, so you're aware, or Neon, has blue hair. Now, of course, she could have changed her hair color, but what if this is something different? These guys might be Saiyan Sufurian hybrids. After all, it is not unlikely that the 2 species might have interbred at some point in their history. Not every Saiyan hybrid has to be with a human. I wonder if Broly and Chilai will test that theory. Seeing how much smarter these guys seem to be in comparison to the rest of their race, it doesn't feel out of place, if it's for the sake of bettering the Saiyan scientific environment. But these are just speculations that we felt it would be nice to share with you guys. And thusly, we end our journey with the Saiyan timeline. If we get more details after this video comes out, we will come back to the topic, as the timeline itself feels pretty weird at this point. We have a lot of periods where nothing happens, whilst at other times you feel that it's so packed that it's almost impossible for all those events to occur at that same point in time. It feels like a material for a separate video though, so watch this space on the MasakoX channel. So what do you guys think? Have these videos provided some kind of clarity for you, or are you just focused on the origins of Neon, really? Leave a comment below and let's get this discussion going. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you for the next one. Catch you later!